Right, on to our next session. I am very much looking forward to this because supply chain is one of the most critical things that we are dealing with now in the industry, especially from a CTI element. I know it's taking up everyone's time, so hopefully there will be a lot of value in this for us. Very modestly, Karla doesn't have a I am Karla introduction slide to this, so I'm going to give a bit of an introduction. And I don't know where to start. There's awards. There's successful businesses, there's nominations for top prizes. She is really very highly accomplished. So this is Karla. She's from Orpheus Cyber, and she's going to be talking about the importance of threat intelligence in monitoring your third-party risk. So thank you, Karla. Over to you.
Thank you. So I'll do a quick introduction on who Orpheus are. If you haven't heard of us, we're obviously a CREST accredited firm, and one of the main things that we do is cyber risk rating. So we're really looking at third-party supply chain risk as a key area, as well as a number of issues around threat intelligence for the bespoke clients that we have and the CBES that we do as well. So talking about third-party security breaches, I think it makes sense to talk about some of the biggest breaches that we've seen and how many of them have actually started within the supply chain. So the Target data breach, one of the most expensive ones to date, which saw 110 million customer records released, was caused through a heating and ventilation company that were able to move across the network and get access to customer data and payment data. Similar for the Marriott breach, one of the biggest in terms of records released, so 339 million guests having their details compromised, started within their supply chain. There have also been breaches within Expedia, which saw just 10 million customer records released, but that started within their hospitality platform and not within Expedia themselves. Instagram, a little bit less famous, but had a breach that started within a third-party supplier, Indian supplier that was providing chat service functions for Instagram. SpaceX, along with Tesla and Lockheed Martin, had a breach from Visa Precision, who were a parts manufacturer supplying to them. And then obviously SolarWinds, I think, has really dominated this year and brought it to public attention how important supply chain risk can be with the number of compromises that originated there. Ticketmaster is probably the closest that you've seen to a fourth and fifth party breach. So we're not really seeing that at the moment, but it's something that I think is going to come over the next few years. So the Ticketmaster breach was caused by one of their chatbots, which was an outsourced supplier to them, and then was ultimately detected by Monzo, who saw fraud on their accounts, which they were able to track back to Ticketmaster and then back through to that chatbot. So it's the closest we've got at the moment, but again, I think we're going to see more and more of these, and we're seeing from customers that they are more interested as well in monitoring the fourth parties and fifth parties in their supply chains, and not just those third party suppliers. So in the last couple of months, we've conducted a survey around how seriously people are taking their third party security. So 78% told us that they've had a breach caused by a third party in the last 12 months, with 11% suffering more than 10 breaches. And I think this is really interesting because we're now starting to see that actually it is very important. It's important that companies take their supply chain seriously. It's really important as well for smaller companies where the landscape is changing. We've talked about this for a few years, that maybe smaller companies need to take their security just as seriously as big ones. And if they don't, then those larger companies aren't going to want to work with them. And I think we've talked about that for so long, but we're actually starting to see this become reality now. And as more companies really start to invest in their third-party security programs, this is becoming more and more important. Now, we have people respond managing up to 30,000 suppliers, and very, very few of them said that they felt that their third-party security programs were mature, that they were happy with them. Most of them were saying that they felt like they were doing okay, but they had a lot of room for improvement. And I think that's where the threat intelligence component comes in. I think we're not necessarily looking to threat intelligence for our supply chain security in the way that we might have been doing already for our general security programs. Another part of the results that came through from that was how often people are checking their suppliers and how they're checking their suppliers. So 88% are actually checking them, which sounds really good, but I think the worrying number in there is that there are 12% of people who just aren't, and they're people who have taken the time to respond to a survey about third-party risk at all. So that's not even necessarily representative of organisations generally, the people that haven't wanted to respond to a survey from us. So I think actually the reality is that number is probably slightly lower. 56% of them said that they were checking annually and 48% using questionnaires. So we'll go on to talk a little bit about the risks involved with that, but just sort of 56%, quite a high number checking just annually. And I think we all know how often the threat landscape changes, so that really that once a year check is probably not going to do much in actually keeping you secure from risks within your supply chain. So if we think about how the questionnaire process tends to work, it gets sent out to suppliers, perhaps all of them, perhaps a select few. Somebody will check those answers, hopefully, typically somebody in procurement. And obviously when you're completing those, as I'm sure many of you have within your businesses, the level of proof that's required is generally quite low, and typically you want to give what you consider to be the right answer. So while, I'm not suggesting that people don't tell the truth in those things, I think there's definitely room for things to be embellished slightly. They get approved or not, and there'll be clauses put into the contract, hopefully, that say what that supplier needs to do to maintain the contract and to maintain that relationship. But again, the chances of those clauses actually being useful in the event of a breach are quite small. Typically, the liability is limited to the value of the contract itself. And if you've put in a clause that says someone has to have a pen test once a year, that doesn't necessarily help you once that breach has already happened. And again, questionnaires are time consuming and they require some level of expertise as well to go through them and actually get some real value from them, which typically I think is not really happening because the amount of security professionals involved in this process is generally quite small. So if we consider what the regulators are saying about third-party risks, they are generally it's the financial services-based regulators that are talking about it, but I think they tend to be a good indicator for future trends industry-wide. And third-party risk is mentioned in other legislation. So GDPR talks about third-party risk, saying you need to work only with suppliers that you are happy that can keep your data protected, which doesn't give you a lot of detail, but it is an indication that it is something that's being considered. In general, they're saying that you should know who your critical suppliers are and have a way of monitoring them and a way of removing them as a supplier if you need to. And the gold standard, the EBA goes the furthest on this, saying that the gold standard is continuous monitoring. So none of them are really enforcing any of this at the moment, but I think it's an indicator of where we're moving to. And obviously the intelligence that we're getting saying that most of these attacks are starting within the supply chain, I think is a good indicator that this is going to be something more and more important. So this, I'm sure, is something that most of you are familiar with, looking at vulnerability, threat and impact. And what we're seeing is that a lot of third-party risk providers are really just focusing on the vulnerability and they're missing that piece around the threat. Now, obviously, if we're providing those services externally, it's hard for us to judge the impact, but we can be more proactive, I think, in incorporating the threat element when we're looking at cyber risk and third-party risk. So if we consider that, then what you need to be thinking about is who your critical suppliers are. And what I'm seeing from people that we're working with is that some of them have a good understanding of maybe who the critical suppliers are, but not necessarily really the impact. So even the ones that have relatively mature programs haven't quite gone to that next step of identifying the impact that their suppliers can have on them should they suffer a breach, or should that breach creep up to them as well. Identifying what they have access to is really important. So, as I mentioned already with the target breach, there's no real reason why your ventilation and air conditioning company should have access to your customer payment details. And I think that's something that's very important as an initial stage for a company to be considering. So the next step is for you to identify and prioritize any gaps. So there needs to be some way that you have of working with your suppliers to look at what gaps they have and what their threat level is. Are they in a sector that is particularly being targeted? So if we think about the Tesla SpaceX breach, actually understanding that the people that manufacture parts and supply up to them are going to be a target. It sounds pretty obvious when you talk it through, but perhaps that wasn't something they'd really considered. So actually looking at those critical suppliers and working out what gaps they have and the threat level that's associated with them is going to be a pretty important part of this process. I think another thing that's really missing at the moment is that the security team are not necessarily being involved in helping to build the relationships with suppliers. Some companies do have third-party risk teams which are doing that, and some are really just relying on their procurement teams to go and kind of mitigate this. But I think actually if we incorporate more threat intelligence into this process, there's a real opportunity for us to share that knowledge and kind of build ecosystems between us where we can communicate and share things that we're seeing as suppliers and as customers. And actually having those relationships is going to be really key to doing that. Suppliers need to feel that they can bring these things to their ultimate customers without necessarily suffering a penalty, but having really seen the benefit of how that can help everybody and how that can help make us all more secure. And that's a part of mitigating the gap. So if you as a customer have far more budget and more intelligence to share with your suppliers, being able to work with them and help mitigate the gaps that you've seen can be a really crucial part of this as well. So if we think about the relevant information and relevant intelligence that companies are generally considering when it comes to their third-party risk. So actually understanding what does the attack surface for your suppliers look like? What technologies are they using? And then understanding the technologies that they're using and the threats associated with those particular technologies. Are they technologies that are out of date and have a higher number of vulnerabilities, or are they technologies that we know threat actors are going after? Understanding that is going to be really crucial to actually how you help them go about mitigating those gaps. And what we're seeing in general is that on the whole, most companies do understand their attack surface, but we have identified a few suppliers of people that we're working with where we've identified technology that they didn't know still existed and that was still connected to them. And they've been able to then go and shut down certain things that they didn't really know still existed. Looking at the countries that they're operating in and particularly their sector, I think is very important. We are seeing certain threat actors go after particular sectors, and I think actually understanding what sectors your suppliers are in and how that could be relevant to you can be a really important part, and possibly one of the most important parts that isn't necessarily being considered. What we see companies being really concerned about is whether they've got any sort of domain abuse or deep and dark web mentions. It's probably the number one thing people say to me is, well, I just want to know if I'm being talked about on the dark web. And I think there's a lot that's being overlooked because they're really focused on actually quite a small element. And so I think actually taking all these things together is going to be a really, really important part for when you're considering how you can use threat intelligence to make your supply chain more secure. So this is one of the things that we provide. So we provide a cyber risk rating, so a score, and we're incorporating the threat along with the vulnerability. So as I mentioned, a lot of providers are really just looking at vulnerabilities. What CVEs do people have? What gaps can they see on their attack surface? And kind of ignoring the threat level to that organization. So it's going to be particularly important to address both of these issues. And a recent Forrester report actually identified something very similar, that actually the threat level to organizations is really being overlooked. Making it actionable is obviously very important when it comes to intelligence. One of the things that I think we all talk about as an industry quite a lot. So cyber risk rating is one way to look at that for your supply chain. I think having a way to identify changes and communicate those changes and communicate the really important changes that happen is going to be a really critical part. So one of those things might be high priority vulnerabilities. When we see a new CVE or we see a CVE that comes out either on a supplier or something that's newly been discovered, having a way to actually alert your supply chain to that and understand if they've been able to mitigate it. Those really kind of high level one-off actions that people can take within your supply chain that's going to help make you all secure, and finding the way to share that knowledge, like I've said already, is really important for how you do that. So quite positively, coming out of the survey that we did, 55% said that they would inform and fix with a supplier. So a few said that they would just inform. I think about 15% said they had literally no way of knowing if something had come up within a third party, so wouldn't be informing or fixing. But I think that was a really positive number to hear, that 55% said they would work with them to fix it. And I think increasing that number is going to be very important. We do need to understand that fixing something within our supply chain benefits all of us. It benefits you as a customer. It benefits potentially the other customers that person is supplying to, as well as to that supplier as well. Smaller businesses are more vulnerable to cyber attacks that could, really penalize them financially. So actually being able to work with them and fix that is going to be a real benefit. So the rating reports that we provide will help customers do just that. We don't just give them a score, we give them a report that talks about their threats and the vulnerabilities that we can see on their attack surface. So we'll be sort of looking at comparisons also to their sector and the average within their sector. And it gives them then instructions on how they can go about kind of making improvements and sharing that knowledge, rather than just telling them that they have a bad score and leaving it up to them to fix. So that's everything that I really wanted to share. I'm hoping there'll be some questions that we can go through, but I think in conclusion, what we're seeing is that actually applying threat intelligence to third-party risk is a newer area for many people, and how important it is, like we do with the rest of our security posture, that we really start with that threat.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Karla. I would just remind everybody that there is the ability to put in questions to Karla. It is via the VVox app, so if you can just make sure you put your questions in there. Just while we wait for those to come through, I'll fire a couple at you. Karla, working with the supply chain is critical, full stop, for organisations at the moment, because you rightly pointed out all of those really horrible breaches have generally come from the supply chain, certainly of late, and it is generally a target for nation states and OCGs nowadays to get into lots of organisations instead of one or two. What's your kind of best practice advice for not just procurement and security, but CTI, to work with the supply chain and communicate with the supply chain what the threat is and why it's important that they work together on these things?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because actually, it's us that have that intelligence. And if we're not then going and sharing that with procurement or with security or with the suppliers, then, they don't necessarily know what intelligence we have to be able to go and share that with them, particularly procurement. I've done a lot of work with some procurement professionals recently who I think didn't really know that some of this stuff was available to them and how they could go and use it. So I think really it's that communication piece of working collectively to go out there and to help our supply chain improve their security and help procurement understand how they can do that. What do they need to be looking at? What do they need to think of? A lot of the people I've spoken to lately have very limited knowledge on security. So actually being able to help them shape their questions so that they can work with us is going to be really useful.
Thanks. And then in terms of the actual CTI team that's doing the work, obviously it's not just easy, they can't just reach out to a lot of these organizations as well. So what are those internal relationships that they might have to have inside their own organization if they're in an internal CTI team to really make the most out of what you're providing?
I think flagging the number of breaches that are occurring through the supply chain is going to be the number one thing. And I think that SolarWinds really helped with that. Suddenly people understand it and they suddenly care about it. So I think that's important. A lot of companies don't actually have a third-party security program at the moment. So I think building the relationships there and then working out who are the people that are responsible for this that you need to go and build relationships with, and giving them those like small little sound bites of information that they can actually use. So, I talked about keeping it actionable. What I thought was actionable a few months ago, I've realized was actually even overwhelming for many people. So, people really, I think, just want one or two little things around this is what you need to go and do. So I think if we can find a way to communicate it like that, then we're going to start seeing more results.
Thanks. Some questions have come through now. There's a bit of a delay for those that don't know. But the first one is, and I hope this makes sense to you, how often are you seeing low CVSS vulnerability scores, I'm presuming, hitting high risk scores?
I'm not sure that question does make sense to me. So how often are low CVE scores versus how many are low versus high?
Yeah, seeing how low CVSS vulnerability vulns hitting the high risk scores.
Okay, I'll answer what I think the question is there. So if I think about the score that we have, low scoring vulnerabilities against our score will have an impact, but we're looking at so many things when we rate companies. So we're looking at their security hygiene overall, we're looking at their threat level, we're looking at a number of things. So it's not just about having, does this company have a load of vulnerabilities on their attack surface? It's really about what else is going on with them and how important or how high their threat level is as well. Are they in a particularly in a sector that's being targeted, or are they being talked about a lot? Those sort of things will impact the score that we provide just as much as having a lot of vulnerabilities. And I think most of the scores or most of the third-party risk programs out there are really focusing so much on vulnerabilities and not really considering whether they're high impact. If it's something that's old that threat actors don't really talk about and aren't really using anymore, then that's not as important as having one that is a critical vulnerability that we see being used actively in breaches right now. So I think it's it's actually having the intelligence to feed into that to understand how important they are rather than just having a number of vulnerabilities.
Okay. And overall, how do you determine that as well in terms of the balance? In terms of they might have a score for whatever that passive recon might be, but also they might be somebody that's highly targeted. They've got a big threat or not very much targeted, and then also balancing that versus what data they are actually doing, what job they're actually doing for the supplier, what services, how important they actually are. There seems to be multiple kind of ingredients to this. So what are the different things that people should kind of look at so that we as suppliers aren't getting inundated with everything all of the time, even if we're only supplying a quick £10,000 threat assessment, for example?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because you will probably do the same security risk questionnaire as somebody who's providing HR services and holding all your employees' data, and they're really not the same thing. So it is all of those things, understanding the impact. So working with a customer at the moment who has a couple of suppliers that are critical to them, but one will affect them quite badly if they were breached in terms of a loss of data. One will affect them in terms of actually whether or not they can continue providing their services whatsoever. So I think you need to understand the impact to the business and how important that is. And then, yes, understanding like that threat level to them as well. You know, having two companies with a similar attack surface where one is higher threat they're really quite different. And equally, you could have somebody that has a very low looking threat surface, you know, low vulnerabilities, but the threat to them is really high. And actually having a low score or, you know, a low number of vulnerabilities doesn't mean that actually there's no risk to you at all. And if they're a critical supplier, you really need to be working with them to understand what are they doing around things which are not those. You know, what are you doing about your insider threat or about your phishing risks? So actually those critical suppliers with a high threat are being mitigated in different ways.
Okay, that sounds good. It's definitely about communication and definitely working. And obviously it's one thing to say, as you say, this is the threat or this is what you look like and here's your score. But it's much more about supporting the supply chain as well to get better and, you know, not just hammering them with questionnaires and scores and expecting them to sort it out. I think that's a really important thing. And I think CTI teams, as you were saying, are really good at potentially doing that and communicating it on a human level as well. We're just coming to the close of this session, Karla, but is there anything else that you think is really important in terms of takeaways for the audience, or any other points that you really want to reiterate at all?
I think that's it. And I think, like you've just said, that communication piece, actually finding a way to share the knowledge and the intelligence that we have as a community and with our supply chains is really important.
Okay, super. Unfortunately there's a delay, guys. So there's 3 or 4 have just flown through. Let me just see if there's any quick ones, are they? There's quite a good one actually here because it will possibly move away from this, but are you asking too much of procurement managers?
Well, maybe. And I think if we're asking them to understand everything about security and how that comes together, as well as being really good at procurement, then possibly. So I think actually understanding where can this sit? Does it need to be a separate team, or how can you work better together? Then, you know, I think that's an improvement, because yes, potentially if we're asking them to understand all of this as well, that is not necessarily what they are trained to do or want to do. True.
But ultimately it could be critical to the future of their business should they suffer a massive breach within the supply chain, which right now for most organizations is where they're most likely to suffer a critical breach. And at the end of the day, if you can get procurement doing on that, working with security and working with CTI teams, then it could ultimately save the business in the future, right? Karla, thank you so much. Really appreciated that. We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be following up with the next session in about 13 minutes, I believe, 7 minutes. So thank you, and I'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.